Catherine. As Catherine was mentioning, my name is Mac. I'm the online managing editor for O'Reilly, and very, very happy to be joined today by JD Roth. JD is not only our guest today, but also a bit of our guinea pig for these, so I appreciate him taking on that task. Just a couple logistical things before we get going today. We're going to spend roughly 35 minutes or so with me firing questions back and forth with JD, and then we're going to turn it over to some audience questions. So we'd like to make this as absolutely conversational as possible. So please send in those questions as we're progressing, and we will save them for the end. But I'm going to be keeping an eye on that chat window as we go through. As Catherine mentioned, the Twitter hashtag for today is YourMoneyTMM, and I believe Marcy posted that in the chat area. So feel free to tweet early and often on that. One note on video, you may see my screen pause occasionally. There is nothing wrong. That just means that I am probably taking a drink of water or trying to make sure that the focus stays on JD and not on me. So with all of that out of the way, let me just give a quick little bit of background on JD. JD Roth is an accidental personal finance expert. Those are his words, not mine. In 2006, he started the award-winning website Get Rich Slowly. For the past 4 years, Get Rich Slowly has grown into an active community with thousands of members. JD is also the author of the recently released O'Reilly title, Money the Missing Man. JD, thanks very much for being with us here today.
My pleasure. It's good to be here.
Great. So, first question I have for you. In your mind, what are the mental aspects of saving? The things that go beyond just the strict budget, just the strict numbers. What are those things that people actually need to consider as they're saving?
Well, there are a lot of things, a lot of mental aspects to saving. To me, as my readers know, and I mention it in the book too, I often say that money is more about the mental aspects of life than it is about the actual numbers, because I think we all understand the basic numbers. We all understand the math behind personal finance, that if you spend more than you earn, you're going to end up in debt or you're going to end up behind. But it's much more challenging to deal with the actual mental aspects, the psychology of things, the emotions, because we're human. We have goals, we have desires, we have dreams, and we're easily persuaded by advertising. And so our spending habits often don't reflect our knowledge of the math. So many of us who end up in debt, and as Max said, I ended up about $35,000 in debt during in 2004 I was $35,000 in debt, and I managed to dig out of it. But I had accumulated that debt because, not because I didn't understand the math, I'm a smart guy, but because I just couldn't control my emotions and impulses. There were all these things I wanted to buy. And so I think that mentally, one of the most important things people can do is to set financial goals and to sit down and actually think about, what is it I want to accomplish with my life? What are the things I want to do? Where do I want to be? And then to construct a financial life around these goals and dreams. Because I think if you're able to do that, you're then able to make the math work in your favor. If you know that it's your goal to take a trip to South America, for example, it's much easier to forego the other choices, like going out for a ski weekend with your friends. As much as that ski weekend with your friends might be fun, it's much easier to save for your bigger goals when you actually have the goals.
So, sort of following up on that, do you feel that there's such a thing as a one-size-fits-all savings technique?
I really don't, to be honest. There are many techniques that work for people, for many people, but I feel like there's no one-size-fits-all technique. I think it's very important to take a look at the various techniques that people recommend and to kind of test drive them for yourself and say, okay, I'm going to take for example, the common recommendation to pay yourself first, which is the notion that you take 5% or 10% or 15% of your income and you set it aside immediately in savings before you do anything else. That's a very common notion, and many people use that successfully. And so I think it's important to take these methods and kind of test drive them first and say, okay, can I make this work for me? And if it works for you, great, use it, implement it, and find ways to incorporate it into your life so it becomes kind of a lifestyle thing. But if it doesn't work, if one particular technique doesn't work, don't get discouraged. Look for other ways. Go out and do some reading, do some research, and see if you can find ways that actually do work for you. Because we're all different. We have different psychology, and what works for one person may not work for another.
I mean, that's actually one of the things, not to venture into pure editorializing here, but one of the things that I really appreciate about the work that you've done, both with your site and with the book too, is that you're taking into account the human element, the fact that we all have different thresholds for this type of thing, and that we all have different levels of willpower. And
Right.
I feel like very often there is a lot of one size fits all advice that goes out there. Do you think that that's a reason why people sometimes sort of, to put it bluntly, fall off the savings wagon, is that they think that there's this model out there that suddenly they're failing and it doesn't work because of them, as opposed to maybe this just wasn't the right conglomeration of factors that would have worked for them.
I don't know how other people are. I suspect this is true, but I don't know how other people are. But for me, that's absolutely one of the things that I found that I really struggled with. When I was in debt back in the 1990s, the only books I ever read said, the only way to pay off debt is to take your high interest debt and to pay it off first. And that's the common advice, and that's the mathematically correct advice. If you pay off your high interest debts first, you're going to make the best progress, and in the long run, you're going to be you're going to pay less in interest. But when I did that, my biggest debt was my highest interest debt. I had this credit card that had $18,000 on it, and it had some 18% or 21% interest rate. And I would try to pay off on that, and it was so frustrating because I felt like I wasn't making any progress whatsoever. And yet every book I read, and my father and my cousin all gave me the same advice. Start with the high interest stuff first. And it wasn't until 2004, 2005 when I read Dave Ramsey's The Total Money Makeover, and he explicitly in that book says, no, don't start with your high interest debt. Instead, start with your lowest balance debt first and pay those off first. It was as if he had given me permission to try something different, and I tried that, and it worked. And so I feel like for me and for many other people, I suspect, this one-size-fits-all advice, it can be frustrating because we try it and we don't succeed, and we try it again and we don't succeed, and we feel like we're doing something wrong. There must be another way. And the truth is, there are other ways. They're not necessarily optimal ways mathematically, but that's okay because I think it's much better to save suboptimally than not to save at all, or to get out of debt suboptimally than to not get out of debt. And it's better to get started with training wheels, I guess, and learn to ride the bike than to try to ride the bike without training wheels and keep crashing and fail. So.
Right. It sounds like dieting in a lot of ways. What you're saying.
Hey, I struggle with that too.
Sure. Right. Right. Atkins doesn't work for everybody, right? So, what are some ways? And this is kind of a touchy-feely question, but what are some ways of making saving fun?
Making saving fun. Well, for me, what I found, and again, I'm going to keep going back to my personal experience because to me, that's what I'm drawing from. Like I say, I'm not necessarily an expert. All I have is my experience and the experience of my readers at Get Rich Slowly. And what I found is I've got to kind of turn it into a game. And so if I turn saving into a game, it becomes fun. It becomes something that I can do and that I enjoy doing. And an example of this is I use what I call targeted savings accounts. So, for example, I might decide, I want a Nintendo Wii. This was the first one that I did, my first targeted savings account I ever did. When the Nintendo Wii was coming out, I was still deep in debt repayment mode. I felt like I can't really afford to buy a Nintendo Wii because I've got to pay off my debt. But I gave myself permission. I said, okay, I'm going to go to my bank and I'm going to open a new savings account. And I asked the bank, I said, hey, is there anything I can do to flag this account that it's something different? And they said, well, we can name it for you. And I said, all right. So we named it the Nintendo Wii account. And I just gradually funneled money into there. Not all of my money because I was still trying to pay off my debt, but I funneled enough in there for a Wii, and uh, it felt very empowering to save for that. And I use that technique for other things. So, for example, saving for my trip to Europe this fall, I'm using that technique to save money. I set up a separate account, and also for my car. I bought a used car last year, but I know that eventually I'm going to want another car, and so I'm saving right along. And I've got this targeted account, and I put money in it right as I go along, and it makes it fun for me because I'm able to see uh, my progress towards these goals.
I need to ask you about the Wii account because
All
that
right.
came up in a previous conversation, and I wanted to dive into that a bit.
Sure.
Was naming it your idea, or was that was a suggestion that somebody at the bank gave you?
No, no, no. I actually picked that up from another book. Robert Pagliarini has a book called The 6 Day Financial Makeover, and in there he suggests targeted accounts. He has another name for it. A targeted account is the name that I'm using, and I thought it sounded kind of goofy, but I thought I could give it a try, and I gave it a try, and it worked, and yeah, it was awesome.
So, not not diverging too far into psychology or whatnot, but is that act of naming something or compartmentalizing it? Do you feel that that's an effective strategy for I don't know, realizing a savings goal?
I do feel like it is, but it's something you've got to be careful with. In behavioral economics, there's a phrase called mental accounting, a term called mental accounting. And essentially, mental accounting is when you receive money and you do compartmentalize it in your head. And this can work for you or it can work against you. Example of ways that it works against you is say you get an inheritance, your grandmother passes away and you get $10,000 or something like that, and you're deep in debt. And in reality, you should use that money to pay off the debt. But people use mental accounting. They say, "Oh, no, 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 this is the inheritance money. It's separate money. I can use it to do whatever I want with." And so you've got to be careful with that. But I think that uh, creating these compartments in your mind, I think it can be an effective tool, not just for saving, but also for budgeting, for planning where you want to spend.
Okay. Um, so getting back to something that you mentioned before and kind of riding on that diet comment that I made before. What do you do when you fail? Right? I mean, it's because that's going to happen. What is the first
Sure.
thing that someone should do if they fail in a savings attempt?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to be careful that you don't exacerbate the problem. Uh, I think the dieting example is good. There are many parallels between dieting and personal finance, and I know that myself right now. I'm really struggling with the diet stuff, the fitness stuff. I gained 20 pounds while writing this book, and so now I'm trying to get rid of those 20 pounds. And uh, last weekend at my birthday party, my bacon-themed birthday party, I actually did okay, but the next day I had a little bit too much to eat, and I got down on myself, and I was like, oh man, I've had too much to eat. And a smart person would say, okay, I've had too much to eat. That's fine. I just won't eat anything else today. But not me. I went and I had more bacon chocolate chip cookies, for example, and it made problems worse. And so I think there's a real danger in doing that with personal finance too. You you act, I'm trying to think of what I'm going to use examples from my own life. I go into a bookstore, and I go into a bookstore and I come out and I buy two or three books, and I feel bad. Oh my gosh, I just spent money on two or three books. I don't really have the money for that. I should have gone to the library. And then because I'm feeling bad, I'm tempted to go out and try to spend more money to try to kind of be a soothing balm, I guess. But and that's where problems occur. You start to spiral, kind of in this downward spiral. And so I think one of the key things is to try to keep away from making matters worse. So when you make a mistake, acknowledge that you've made a mistake. Absolutely acknowledge that you've made a mistake. But say, okay, it's done. Um, that's fine. I'm not going to make another mistake. I'm going to try to learn from this, and I'm not going to make matters worse. Other things you can do is you can try to reverse mistakes sometimes too. Sometimes you make a financial mistake. Say you go out and you actually buy a Nintendo Wii, to use that example again, and you bring it home, you don't open it, you think, I really shouldn't have done that. Well, you can take the Wii back. And So I think as much as possible, people should try to reverse their mistakes, and it's not always possible, of course. And
Right.
yeah,
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, that was something that I enjoyed reading in sort of the advance I saw of your book, is that if you don't allow it to become bigger instantly, you've got a better chance of
right,
stopping it in its tracks and perhaps even reversing it, right?
yeah.
So, can you give a couple examples? I know the weed savings account is one example, but can you give a couple other examples of techniques that you use, particularly ones I think that you use to dig yourself out of debt? Because I think that's a very relevant topic for a lot of folks.
You mean like mental tricks that I play and
Yeah, anything. Whether it's, I mean, I think that the we account is a great one because it doesn't seem, it's not super obvious when you think about it. Going, oh well, yeah, I could set up just a separate savings account and I name it and then I use that as a goal driver.
right.
But whether it's mental, whether it's simple actions that you take, anything that you've used that you feel is effective.
Well, okay. One technique that I use to this very day that I find tremendously effective is what I call the 30-day technique. It doesn't have to be 30 days. Well, I'll explain it, and then we'll talk about how it doesn't have to be 30 days.
Sure.
So, what I do is when I decide I want something, say I go to the store and I decide I want a new bicycle. I'm looking for a bike. I go to the store, I find this bicycle, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I love this bike, but it's $1,200. Um, Instead of just buying it right there at the store, which is what I used to do, I used to just always buy whatever I wanted immediately. Instead of buying the bike and paying the $1,200 immediately, I'll write whatever it is I want. I'll write it down on a list. I have a text document that I use, and I also use my Amazon wish list. It's basically not really a wish list. It's just a list of things that I want, and I'm trying to put off buying. And so I'll put the item on my list or my Amazon wish list, and then I'll wait. I'll wait 30 days is what I'm trying to wait. And if after 30 days I come back and I look at that and I say, I really do want that and I can afford it, well then I allow myself to buy it. But what I find is that most of the time I don't actually want these things. It's something that seems awesome in the moment, and if I were just buying on impulse, yeah, absolutely I would buy it. And it'll probably just end up becoming more stuff, as I call it, stuff with a capital S, and it would just sit around and be unused. But now I've lost my train of thought. But by using the list, I'm able to put off these purchases and only purchase the things that I actually really do want.
Right. I like that. It's like your own sort of layaway, right? Um,
Yeah.
there were some questions that came in previous to our discussion today, and I'm going to weave
Okay.
some of those in because I think some folks, I actually really appreciate that people took the time to submit some of those questions through the registration process. Um, this is one that I actually have a little bit of experience with. Some family members have completely stopped contributing to their 401ks over the course of the last year, and
Right.
where I probably would have scoffed at that idea a couple of years ago, thinking, well, why aren't you at least maximizing the employee match? Because that's essentially free money in a lot of ways.
Right.
It was very hard to disagree with them, given what's happened in recent years. What's your perspective on that? Do you think that people should sort of toe the line on that and continue to contribute as much as they can to employer retirement plans, Roths, that kind of thing?
I do actually. I absolutely do. My own perspective is, after having read a lot of the financial literature, a lot of books on investing, I'm able to see what the long-term returns to the stock market are. So this gets into an area where I'm a little uncomfortable, but I'm going to go anyway. I want to make it very clear to people out there that I'm not a financial professional, and this is just based on my reading. When you invest, it's very important to understand that you're investing for the long term. And in the long term, the stock market has a tendency to grow. The long-term return to the stock market, say 30-year average, is roughly around 10% annual returns over 30 years. And there are some 30-year periods that are lower than that, and there are some 30-year periods that are higher, but in general, it stays right around 10%. The problem is average isn't normal. Even though you've got an average return of about 10% per year over 30-year periods, you have one-year returns that are sometimes minus 40%, as they were in 2008. And you have other one-year periods where, like in 2009, where I don't actually remember what the growth was last year, but it was around 40% too, I think. And so you've got these wild fluctuations. And in general, the stock market never really hits that average. There are going to be ups and downs. So you've got to have, in some ways, you've got to have this faith. You've got to trust that, yeah, the long-term averages are going to continue. And if you don't have this faith, if you're unable to accept the risk, then you need to reduce the amount of money you have in the stock market and put it in other forms of investments, such as bonds, where your returns are going to be smaller because there's less risk, but you're not exposing yourself to these wild fluctuations that make it so you can't sleep at night. Because ultimately, you've got to be able to sleep at night. But just real quick, I think that the last year has been very instructive. I know that a lot of people did pull money out of their 401ks or stop contributing to their 401ks, but I think if you look at the last year, you can see that that was a mistake, because the stock market has grown by leaps and bounds over that 1 year period, and the people who stopped contributing have now missed out on all this growth.
Right. I mean, sort of an addendum to that too. I've seen some people taking the tact of, oh, I'll get back in when it turns around. And isn't that, I mean, aren't you a little late to the game if you get back in once it, and how do you define turnaround, right?
Well, and how do you define it, and how are you going to know? I think that there's a real problem with trying to time the market, trying to guess when the turnaround is going to occur. Because to be honest, nobody knows. If they did, you'd have professional investors, mutual fund managers, and so on, that were able to beat the market on a regular basis. And the reality of the situation is you don't have these folks. Aside from Warren Buffett, and he takes a completely different approach. I mean,
Sure.
He owns the company, so he has a different approach. But the truth is, there aren't professional investors who can regularly time the market. So why do we as amateurs think we're going to be able to? And so instead of trying to time the market, my personal recommendation, and what I do myself, is I just try to contribute regularly. I'm not always able to contribute every month. And in fact, because of the way my income works, I never know how much my income is going to be. I actually just do yearly contributions. But I do just I try to contribute on a regular basis. And I think it's a good way to mitigate the risks of declines and take advantage of growth too.
Right. One question that just occurred to me, whenever you get a 401k packet or anything, actually, you sign up for a mutual fund, you get this massive amount of information, just a mountain of prospectus and charts and graphs and all that.
Right.
What do you do with that stuff? I mean, do you recommend that people actually try to parse all of that, or, what's the approach there? Because I personally, yeah, please go ahead.
Go ahead, I'm listening.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, for me personally, I get that stuff, and I go into it thinking, okay, sure, I'll take a look at this, and I'll go into some serious debt. Looks like we're having a volume problem. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, I'm going to trudge forward. Yeah, so all of that stuff. What do you do with that stuff? Do you actually read it? Do you try to understand it? What's your recommendation?
Okay, my recommendation is that people should do their best to understand the basics of investing as much as possible. So find some excellent books on investing. I've got a chapter on investing in Your Money, the Missing Manual, and O'Reilly will be publishing Personal Investing, the Missing Manual, and I think that'll have a lot more information. But there are other books out there too. So it's important to understand the mechanics of investing and the history of investing. I think William Bernstein's The Four Pillars of Investing is a good place to start. But to understand the basic fundamentals, because if you try to read through this stuff and you don't understand the fundamentals, a lot of it is just gibberish. I mean, you look at it and you're like, equities. What are equities? And what's a large cap growth fund? I have no idea. And so getting those basics will help you parse the information. And then when you do get the prospecti and the other documents from your mutual fund, I get them in the mail too, and they're huge. They're like 50 pages long sometimes, these documents. And so I don't read them all completely, but I think it's very important to read as much as possible and to skim it. I'm a very big believer that people should read their financial documents, especially credit card contracts. I do read my credit card contracts, and they're huge, and they're full of legalese, and they suck. But it's important to read that so you know what you're getting into. And I also read any other kind of document that I sign. I read my entire mortgage contract before I signed it. And I think it's important that people do this. So with the mutual funds, get a basic background of information that you can build on, and then use that information to be able to read through and understand what you're seeing, I guess. And but yeah, I don't recommend just chucking them aside.
Sure, as much as that might be the impulse, right?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, what about calling up a mutual fund or a 401k manager, that type of thing? I've actually found that those folks have been very helpful.
I've never done that.
Well,
So,
there you go.
so you actually call the mutual funds themselves and ask for explanations of how the mutual fund operates?
Anytime I've ever had a question about, how it operates and what I can expect, because sometimes I'll wade through that information and just have, more questions than answers. And
Yeah,
sometimes, it's my internet side kicks in, and I go, well, I just want to be able to search against this document, look for this query.
right.
And the next best thing there is just calling someone up. Now, I have no idea if that extends across, money management and 401ks and
Uh,
mutual funds, but I have
yeah,
found them pretty useful.
I think that you've hit on a very important point, Mac. I think one of the most valuable skills a person can have is the ability and willingness to ask questions, because too many times we just take what we're given. We take the mutual fund prospectus, we take the credit card document, we take the mortgage loan, uh, or we just take what we're given at the store, and we don't ask questions. We don't bother to challenge it. We don't bother to try to negotiate. And I think that it's very important for people to stand up for themselves. Another one of my mantras is that nobody cares more about your money than you do. And I think it's very important to take it upon yourself to not just go with what you're given. If you read through your mutual fund documents or your credit card documents, whenever I read a credit card contract, I almost always have questions, and I almost always call the hotline to figure out, well, to ask, hey, I'm reading here, I don't understand what this two-cycle billing is. Can you explain it to me? And sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. And I want to also point out that even though I do read all my credit card contracts, there are times when there are things I don't understand, and I get bit. I mean, the credit card contracts are not consumer friendly.
Right. Yeah. Right. Anything that's printed in 6-point type, I think, doesn't count as consumer friendly. No,
Right.
that's a good point. Not to continue to draw analogies to other things, but a lot of what you're saying there reminds me of sort of the advocacy that you need to take in the medical world too. Of the only person
Yeah.
who's actually going to care about you as a patient is you. Your doctor might try, but ultimately it's
Hmm.
up to you. Um, so I got a couple other questions here. This is one that came in through the registration beforehand. There's a question about how do you approach saving if you've been out of work for a while? And that's unfortunately something that a lot of people are encountering these days.
That's a great question, and to be honest, it's something that I've never had to deal with myself, and so I don't have any practical experience with it. Um, it seems to me that if you're out of work and you don't have income coming in, you can't actually do a lot of saving.
Sure.
Instead, what you've got to do is try to minimize your expenses. So, in the book, and in my personal philosophy, I talk about the notion of cash flow. To me, cash flow is the fundamental principle of personal finance, and cash flow is essentially what you earn minus what you spend, and whatever's left over is your cash flow. And if you have positive cash flow, well, then you're building wealth. If you have negative cash flow, you're either going in debt or you're spending down your savings. And so, if you don't have any income coming in, if you're out of work, you're by definition you've got negative cash flow. You're paying out more than you're bringing in. And so when that happens, you've got to do what you can because you can't save, because you don't have any income to save. You've got to do what you can to reduce your expenses so that your cash flow is your negative cash flow is smaller.
Right. Uh, so another question that came in for folks who have done everything right, say that they've tucked away a nice amount of money, they have weathered the storm reasonably well that we've all been going through. How can they get the most out of their money in a safe way moving forward? I mean, are there
Right.
of particular? I'm not saying that you need to advocate for particular funds or banks or anything like that, but do you know of ways that somebody could say, okay, I've got my nest egg and I want to boost this a little bit, but I want to be smart about it. What would you recommend for them?
Well, the first thing to understand, and I alluded to this earlier, is there's this very close relationship between risk and reward. So in order to get a high return, you've got to be willing to take greater risk, and that usually entails like putting money in the stock market or something like that. I'm not necessarily talking about going out and speculating on, well, gambling. I don't have a good example there, but I'm not talking about high risk investments. But the greater risk you're willing to take, the greater chance of, the greater your potential return in general. So if you're looking for a safe investment, you're not going to get a very high yield, especially right now in the financial environment we've got. Economically, the culture right now is pushing for low interest rates because it's my belief it's because they want to encourage people to invest in the stock market and to put their money back out there in play because everything's been frozen up for almost 2 years now. They're keeping interest rates low, and I think they're going to stay that way until they feel like the economy's humming along again. So if you're looking for safer investments, though, and you understand that you're not going to be able to get a higher return for that, a couple of options are to look for high-yield savings accounts. Your savings account at your local bank, they're probably going to pay you like 0.1%. I think that's what Wells Fargo pays up here, 0.1%, and that's a pittance. So you can go online and at places like moneyrates.com or just do a search for savings accounts, and you can find high-yield savings accounts. And right now, their returns aren't that great either. You're looking at like 1.3%, which again is very low, but that's because economically the government's trying to encourage us to put our money back out in the economy. Another option, and one that doesn't get a lot of play, not many people know about this, is many small banks and credit unions have what are called rewards accounts, rewards checking accounts. And the way these work is you can put up to $25,000 usually. The guidelines I'm about ready to describe vary from bank to bank. You can put about $25,000 into the account, and as long as you make between 10 and 12 debit transactions a month, using your debit card at a point of purchase at like a grocery store, some kind of point of purchase, you sign up for electronic statements, you can get a very high return on that money. You can get like a 4 or 5% return, and it was actually up around 6 or 7% before the economy tanked and the rate started going down. So I think looking for rewards checking accounts is a good kind of stealth technique to find higher returns.
Right. What about something like, I see this all the time, like ING accounts where they presumably pass along more savings because they've reduced their infrastructure, that type of thing.
Right.
Those options?
Yeah, so the high yield savings accounts that I was talking about earlier, that's like the ING account. And that's actually where my cash is, the stuff that I'm keeping liquid, and my targeted savings account. I keep it with ING Direct. But there are other options. I'm not shilling for ING Direct. It's just where I keep my money, and there are many other options.
Right. Now, this is kind of a weird question. I think I already know your answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Do you have any recommendations for savings programs that are outside of the boundaries of banks, mutual funds, 401ks? I have to ask if it's something like real estate, for example. I mean, are those things viable? Are those things that people should pursue, or are those things that are best left to folks who really do a lot of homework in regards to that?
Well, I think absolutely it's for people who do a lot of homework. I think that anything involved with your finances, you need to do your homework. Savings accounts, these are for everybody because it's easy for people to understand how savings accounts work, and it's easy to do your homework on that. But when you get into these other investments like real estate, for example, you absolutely need to be able to do your homework and take the time to make sure you understand it. Don't just because your cousin Joe comes to you and says, "Hey, I've got a great deal in real estate. You're going to make a guaranteed 12%." Uh, don't just trust that. You've got to do your homework and stuff. I do want to say that my neighbor across the street, and my readers are very familiar with him because I call him the real millionaire, the real millionaire next door. He's a retired shop teacher who's managed to build a lot of wealth. Um, he actually goes down here, the nearby city. It's not a bank. It's like a lending agency. They take money from people like my neighbor, and they pay out a pretty high rate. I think it's 4.5% right now, and then they lend it to people who are like high risk auto loans. I guess you see the auto stores that advertise, "We'll lend money to anyone." Well, that's because they're using places like this, these finance
Sure.
companies. And but my neighbor across the street swears by this place. But the thing is, the money he puts in there is not insured. The place could go belly up, and he's lost all his money.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's one.
But he's willing to he's willing to take that risk. It's a risk he's willing to accept.
Sure, sure. And I imagine if you actually have money to play with, you could down that road. It's when you're using savings that you're going to rely upon that it could be an issue.
And that's it. I think that's a good delineation, Mac. With the money that you need and you got to have for something, say like a down payment. Say you're saving for a down payment on a house.
Sure.
You don't want to put that money into the stock market. You want to put that someplace safe, like a savings account, where you know it's going to be there when you need it. Hello?
I'm here, but apparently I've got a phone ringing in the background, so apologies.
Ah.
We're going to immediately hang up on those people. Um, Alfredo, yes, Alfredo Delgado in the chat room. Nigerian investment opportunities coming in via email. Yes, I don't think that are a recommended strategy, but
No.
I'm sure we've all encountered those before. Something I wanted to loop back to that I picked up in some of your writing. What are things that people can give up? And I'm thinking, magazine subscriptions. Apologies to any magazine publishers who may be attending today. Cable, that sort of thing. Are those sort of quick hit things that people can do to recoup some money pretty quickly, and then maybe put that back into savings?
It's going to depend on who you are and what kind of things you buy, of course. This is something that's very individual. But yeah, I think that the way I look at it is one of the quickest ways you can boost your cash flow. Say you've decided, I really got to get out of debt, or I'm just falling so far underwater. I've got to find a way to get more money. One of the quickest ways to boost your cash flow is to reduce recurring monthly expenses. And so recurring monthly expenses are things like magazine subscriptions, your cell phone and cable bill, or your utilities, and memberships, gym memberships, and so on. And some of these things you need. You need your heating, your electricity.
Sure.
So you can find ways to cut down on those and to conserve energy, and do what you can to reduce the cost on those. But for a lot of this, to reduce recurring monthly expenses, you're going to have to do things like cancel the gym club membership, cancel your magazine subscriptions, and find creative ways to fill the void. So an example I use in the book, and I use a lot, is that in my own life, I had a deluxe cable package, and I don't remember exactly what it cost. It's like $65.82 per month or something like that. And so I had this deluxe cable package, and I didn't actually watch much TV. I mean, I enjoyed what I watched, and I watched it from time to time, but I decided, I really want to get out of debt. I want to be out of debt more than I want to watch television. And so I called the cable company, and I cut back from $65.82 per month to It's now $12.59 or something like that. So essentially, I cut $50 a month out of my. I freed up $50 a month in my budget, which is $600 a year, just by reducing my cable television. And that's what worked for me. For other people, it might be magazines, it might be newspapers. For my wife, it would be her daily coffee would be something she could look to cut out. And it's important to remember that you don't necessarily have to give these things up forever. I think some people are afraid to sacrifice these things because they're like, oh, I like to watch basketball on television. I don't want to give that up. Well, you've got to decide what's more important to you. You've got to decide what fits in with your goals.
Right.
And you've also got to recognize that by giving these things up, it's not a forever thing. And again, another example from my own life is I collect comic books, as most people know. And so to help get out of debt, I had to reduce my monthly spending on comic books. And that was only a temporary thing. That lasted for 2 or 3 years. And once I was out of debt, I've been able to bump my comic book spending back up. And it doesn't actually harm my budget because I no longer have these debt payments. And so I'm able to go back to what I was doing before.
Sure, right. So you could get your deluxe cable package again at some point, right?
I could, but
Sure.
I've actually found alternatives to that.
Right. Oh,
And,
are you on the Hulu route? Is that what you're doing?
Well, I do a couple of things. We for the stuff we really, really want, we buy via the iTunes music store.
Sure.
So we buy seasons, and it ends up being much cheaper than paying for cable because we can get The Amazing Race, and we can get The Biggest Loser, and we can get The Office and 30 Rock. Those are the 4 shows we buy, and it costs maybe $120 a year instead of the extra $600 a year I was doing.
Right.
We're also Netflix members, so we can get a lot of the stuff streaming via Netflix, and
Right.
it's not new stuff, but old television shows are still good.
Yeah. So one other question that came in through the registration stuff. If people have taken a significant hit in their retirement savings over the last year or so, should they bring into the new environment this idea that they're going to actually be able to recoup those losses, or should they look at this as, okay, this is where I'm at and I need to make the best possible decision from this moment forward?
If I understand the question correctly, you're asking, should they try to get back the money they lost?
Yeah, in a way, I guess it's more of a psychological question than anything else. This idea that if you lost, let's say you lost 40%, something like that,
Right.
and things seem to be on slightly better footing right now, and maybe things are evening
Right.
out a bit. Should people try to take an aggressive approach, perhaps one that they think, okay, I'm going to get my 40% back,
Right.
or should they instead say that 40% is gone, and now I'm trying to just make the best possible decisions for the moment that I'm in, not trying to overcome a deficiency that was caused by something that in a lot of ways was outside of all of our control.
Right. I actually lean toward the latter. I mean, there are people, and I have friends who are doing this, who want to be aggressive. Their risk tolerance is high enough that they're willing to be aggressive to try to make back the money they lost. But I think there's a real danger in that because when you do this, you do take on additional risk, and you do run the risk that you're going to lose even more money. I think the best thing overall is to have a plan, to understand what your investment policy is. So in Your Money, the Missing Manual, I briefly cover investment policy statements, which are basically just guidelines that you set for yourself that say, okay, this is what percentage money I want in stocks, this is what percentage money I want in bonds, and this is my target return, and this is how I'm going to try to approach obtaining that return. And I think that if you have this policy and you have these investment goals, I think it's important to just stick to those and not be swayed by the buffeting of the market, because the market's going to go up and down, and you are going to lose a lot of money at times, and sometimes you're going to gain a lot of money. And so I think it's more important to have that plan that you can refer to, kind of like a roadmap. And when you get lost, when you lose your way, you can look at the map and say, all right, I'm supposed to do this, I'm just going to stick to this. But It can be tough. Again, it goes to that mental aspect of money. It can be very tough to do that.
Are there ways of blending goals with I don't know, outside responsibilities or outside influence. And what I mean by that is something like some of the most successful internet stuff that's going on right now, it relies on game theory, just some sense of competition that's going on there, or some sense of if I don't match this goal, somebody's going to be disappointed in me. Now, I'm not trying to say that people should feel bad about themselves. It's just those types of things where it's not such an insular perspective, where you're relying on some of those psychological components. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I've never actually done any of this myself, but I know that there's a website out there called stickk.com. So it's like stick.com with an extra K at the end. And it's basically a website that's designed to let people pursue goals and be accountable in kind of a different way. And so I'm wanting to refer to the book to get my terminology right. But I think they call them accountability contracts or something like that.
Right.
And basically the idea is you get a partner and you say, all right, I want to get out of debt by X date, or I want to save enough money to do this thing. And you make a contract. You say, if I don't do this, the consequence is I will contribute $500 to the Republican Party or to the Democratic Party, whichever one would make you most uncomfortable. And so it's meant to be this negative consequence. And so
Sure.
It's a way to try to keep you accountable.
That's interesting.
It's kind of like betting with yourself.
Sure. Yeah.
I've got like a Harley Davidson revving up out
That's
there.
nice.
Is
that your neighbor across the street who?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm up in my office right now. So
That's all right. I don't
know what's going on.
People calling me, so apologies. I noticed that there was some talk in the chat window about managed funds versus index funds and fees that get associated with that. Do you have any thoughts about those? Any recommendations about those?
Well, there are two different camps, and I happen to fall into the index fund camp because based on my research and the documentation that I've seen, all the research seems to indicate that one of the best predictors, or perhaps the best predictor of investment returns when you're talking about a mutual fund, are the fees associated with the fund, because you can't control what the market's going to do. You can't control a lot of aspects, but one thing you can do is reduce fees. And so the lower the fees are, the higher the funds tend to return over the long term. In general, an index fund, for people who don't know, is just a mutual fund that tries to track the movement of a specific index. So for example, if you have an S&P 500 index fund, its goal is to try to mimic the actual movement of the S&P 500 stock market index. And so by definition, the index fund is never going to return above the average of what the market does over a period of time. But the thing is, over the long term, that average is actually pretty good. And studies show, I'm not going to be able to quote the numbers exactly, but that over periods longer than a few years, the index funds gradually float to the top so that they beat, say, 80%. And again, I don't know the exact number, but I believe it's 80%, right around there. They beat 80% of managed funds. And managed funds are where you've got a mutual fund manager who's trying to pick the stocks that are going to beat the market. And it costs more to do that. And these costs eventually degrade the returns. So the index funds float to the top.
Right. One thing I've been hearing a little bit about lately is how the fact that interest rates are low is affecting people who have been trying to live on their interest. They've got money put aside and they've been counting on those things. Is that and I don't know how much experience you have with this or if you have a perspective on it, but do you see that as a detrimental thing that's going on, where you've got and I can understand the argument people might have of saying I did everything right, I've been putting my money away and I've been trying to live off of the interest and be responsible for it, and now I'm getting penalized for it. Is that true? And do you have any perspective on that whole development?
I don't have much exposure to it, and I haven't actually talked to many people about it. I was actually talking with my attorney last night. We went out to dinner, and we were talking about living off interest. It was, I don't even know why it came up, but
dinner conversation. Right?
Yeah, there are there are a lot of things that you got to be careful of. I mean, I think we all, okay, not all, but many of us, we dream of having enough of a nest egg that we can put the money in the bank or in municipal bonds or some other low risk investment and just live off of the interest. So, say for example, you have $1 million in the bank, and it's able to, or not in the bank. Well, okay, let's use the bank, and the bank is giving you 5% interest. Well, you're getting $50,000 a year then, and in theory, depending on what your spending's at, that should be enough to live on. And but the problem, like you're saying, Mac, is in this kind of environment where the best returns you can get is like 1.3%. All of a sudden, that $50,000 you had counted on is only going to be $13,000 a year, and you're probably not going to be able to live on it. You're going to have to draw down some of your principal. Um, and I don't know what I think about this because again, it's not something that I've been exposed to a lot.
Sure.
It goes to being not just trusting that things are going to work out and remembering that you care more about your money than anybody else does, and understanding the relationship between risk and reward.
Sure.
I mean, there are a lot of things rolled up here. So
No, I think that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but you're right. I mean, that's that what we've been encountering over the last couple of years certainly feels like an anomaly. But even if we look at the flip side of that, of the hyper growth that happened, that also was a bit of an anomaly as well. And
well,
the
and you know, the other danger is once the economy does recover, there right now we've had very low inflation. When I was researching for the book, I was noticing that we had a couple of months with negative inflation or right around zero inflation, and in general it runs about 3.5, 4%. And so when you're talking about the an average 4% return from a savings account, that's actually just right around inflation. And uh, I don't know. You got to be worried about inflation too.
Sure. There's a question that came in through the chat. How do you feel about personal financial planners?
Uh, well, I'm actually beginning to try to find one for myself. I mean, uh, or thinking about it anyway. I'm fortunate that in my work I've managed to hook up with a couple of good ones, and so I can chat with them and consider hiring them. But I think financial planners can be an excellent uh, resource for people who have more complicated questions or who don't feel comfortable with their own uh, making their own financial decisions. They want some outside input.
Right.
The problem that people run into is financial planners, in general, they want to work with people who have larger pools of assets, so more money saved. Uh, when I talk to financial planners, they tell me, "Oh, I want you to have $250,000 or $500,000 or even $1 million." That they want people to have this much money because, in general, they make money. Well, I don't want to go into the financial models because I don't understand it completely.
Sure.
I don't want
Sure.
to misspeak.
Right.
So, but I think when you look for a financial planner, it's important to find somebody who's has specific credentials because there aren't any regulations. I could call myself a financial advisor. Mac, you could call yourself a financial advisor.
Done.
Anyone
Sure.
could call
Right.
themselves a financial advisor. But to be a certified financial planner, for example, you have to take a series of courses. You have to pass a test. You have to subscribe to a standard of ethics and so on. So I think it's important to look at the person that you're considering hiring and look at their credentials and ask for references.
Right. Looks like there's a couple folks who posted through the chat too of going for fee-based versus commissions.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
Um,
Now you
and the fees won't necessarily be cheap, but at least you know that they're not recommending products because they're trying to sell you something.
Sure, and that would certainly seem important. Now at the beginning you were talking about how this journey for you began when you were trying to get yourself out of debt.
Right.
That's something that a lot of people encounter. Again, getting back to sort of the psychological component because I think that's a thread that runs through a lot of your stuff.
Yeah.
What is the mindset that somebody should take on that you would recommend that they take on if they're ready to start getting out of debt, but they need to make that first step? Is it I'm going to take all of this on, I see this as a challenge, or is it I'm going to do one thing right now and then tomorrow I'm going to do one more?
I think it's important to take it one day at a time.
Right.
You absolutely have to have some kind of big picture. You have to understand the big picture and what your ultimate goal is. But I think you need to break these goals down into steps, because I know that when I started, I sat down in October of 2004 and I looked at what I had, and I had $35,000 in debt, and I had a negative cash flow. I was like, I don't even know how I'm going to make this work. It was overwhelming. And so what I did is I broke it down into pieces. I said, all right, how soon do I think I can make this happen? I said, I just arbitrarily picked 5 years. So my goal was by October 2009 to have everything paid off. And so I said, okay, how can I make this happen? And I broke down and did 1-year plans. And I didn't work backward, I worked forward. And I said, what's the very first thing I can do? And I picked one debt. I don't remember which debt it was. And I said, I think I can have this debt paid off in about 6 months. And again, I used the Dave Ramsey method, where he starts with low balances first. And so I tackled that. And by breaking it down into these small pieces, and I also had small pieces on how to increase my income by selling things and by taking outside work. By taking these small steps, it made it something that I could do right now, and it didn't feel intimidating. And even when I did break down into small steps, say pay off that first debt, I then broke those down into smaller steps too. So I said, all right, to pay off this debt, then I'm going to need to save X in the first month, Y in the second month, and so on.
Right. Well, we are coming up against our hour. That went by quick.
Mm-hmm.
So
by very quick.
Yeah. So I guess we're going to wrap that up. And thanks to everybody for joining in today. JD, thank you very much for serving as our video guinea pig. I think it went pretty well. Harley's and phones in the background.
You haven't done video before?
Not like this. Not like this. No.
Huh.
So again, thanks a lot for participating, and thank you to everybody else for joining us today. Catherine, I don't know if you had any wrap up that you wanted to do, but in terms of our interview, that pretty much does it for us today.
Thank you, guys. That was great. I don't have much to say. I just want to let people know that we'll have a recording of this shortly, and we also would really appreciate it if you'd take our survey. It'll appear in your browser after you leave this meeting. Just give us some feedback so we can improve what we're doing. We really appreciate it. And that's all. Thanks, JD. I'm wiser now than I was before. And thanks, Mac.
You bet. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, guys.